The blueprint had been corrected by hand. Sterling Vance noticed it the moment he walked into the penthouse boardroom at 6:47 in the morning, long before his executive team arrived, long before the city of Vancouver properly stirred to life. A single yellow sticky note was pressed against the southeast corner of the structural elevation, precise handwriting in black ballpoint pen that belonged to no one on his payroll. He set down his coffee, black, 2 sugars, from the cart on Robson, and leaned over the drafting table. He read the note once, then again. His jaw tightened somewhere around the second reading. The note detailed a catastrophic error in the seismic dampening system across the tower's 23rd through 28th floors. The kind of mistake that wouldn't surface during standard review. The kind that would sail through permit approval and only announce itself during the first significant earthquake, when the building would twist instead of flex, when the shear walls would crack in patterns nobody's models had predicted, when the whole beautiful glass tower would sing its own death song in 4.2 seconds of structural failure. The kind of error that would kill people. Not immediately, not obviously, but slowly, over years of cumulative stress, until one day the building would simply give up and the bodies would be buried in the rubble of someone else's mistake. The note didn't just flag the problem. It solved it. 4 lines of immaculate mathematics, a damping coefficient recalibrated, the load path rerouted through 3 additional cross braces that his own team of structural engineers, men with doctorates and decades of experience, men who had been hired specifically because they were the best in their field, had entirely overlooked. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind of writing that came from someone who had spent years learning to make every letter count, because they never had enough paper to waste. Sterling straightened slowly. He felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck, the instinctive caution of a predator who suddenly realized the prey might be something else entirely. Something dangerous in a way he hadn't anticipated. Something that made him want to pay attention in a way he hadn't done in years. He called security. The footage from the boardroom camera showed a young man in a gray maintenance uniform, a cleaning cart parked just inside the door. He'd come in just after midnight to vacuum, had stopped in front of the drawing spread across the table, and had stood there for what the timestamp showed was exactly 5 minutes and 17 seconds. Just looking, head tilted slightly to one side, one hand resting on the cart handle with the casual grace of someone who had all the time in the world. Then he'd pulled a pen from his breast pocket, written the note with quick, confident strokes, pressed it to the drawing with the careful precision of someone placing a surgical instrument, and gone back to vacuuming without a moment's hesitation. No second-guessing, no checking his work, no indication that he'd done anything more remarkable than making a grocery list. Sterling watched the clip 3 times, then a 4th time, because something about the young man's posture bothered him. There was a familiarity there, a comfort with the material that shouldn't have existed in someone who was supposed to be pushing a vacuum cleaner. "Who is he?" he asked the security supervisor, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who was used to having his questions answered immediately and accurately. The supervisor checked his tablet, fingers moving quickly across the screen. "Elias Cross, sir. Night shift cleaning crew. Been with the building services contractor about 11 months. His file is clean, no complaints, perfect attendance record. He's apparently very reliable." "Elias Cross," Sterling repeated, tasting the name. He scrolled through the employee file on the supervisor's tablet, reading quickly. 26 years old. Previous employment, various maintenance and janitorial positions. Education, some university, incomplete. Emergency contact, listed as a younger brother, Julian Cross, age 19. No listed Omega designation on the file. It wasn't legally required anymore, though most people still included it out of convenience. But Sterling's alpha instincts were already telling him what the file couldn't. He'd know an Omega anywhere. He'd been scenting them for 20 years, had learned to read the subtle cues that others missed. And this Elias Cross, whoever he was, had the kind of calm, centered presence that marked a man who had his biology under iron control. No heat scent, no distress pheromones, just the quiet competence of someone who'd learned to manage himself in a world that didn't always make things easy for people like him. But there was something else too. Something about the way the Omega moved in the footage, the economy of motion, the way he'd handled the blueprints like they were his native language. Sterling's instincts were telling him to pay attention, to dig deeper, to find out exactly what he was dealing with. He found Elias Cross in the sub-basement, restocking the supply closet near the service entrance. The young man was maybe 5'8", lean, but with the kind of wiry strength that came from physical labor rather than a gym membership. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of someone who'd learned to be efficient because he'd never had time to waste. Dark hair, close cropped, a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone who understood angles, and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green. Intelligent eyes, watchful eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He was wearing the standard gray maintenance uniform, sleeves rolled to the elbows revealing forearms that were corded with muscle, hands that were steady and capable. His scent was subtle, clean soap, something like rain on concrete, and underneath it, the unmistakable warmth of an Omega who had his biology firmly in hand. No nervousness, no fear, just the quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Sterling stood in the corridor for a moment, watching him work. It wasn't often that someone caught him off guard. He was 34 years old, an alpha who'd built an empire from nothing, a man who'd learned to read people the way other men read stock reports. But this young man, this Omega in a maintenance uniform, had done something that none of his highly paid engineers had managed. He'd made Sterling Vance feel genuinely curious. No, more than curious. He'd made him feel something he hadn't felt in years. The thrill of discovery. The sense that he'd stumbled across something rare and valuable that no one else had noticed. Elias Cross, Sterling said, stepping into the light of the supply closet. Elias turned, and something flickered across his face. Not fear. Sterling would have recognized fear, had cultivated it in lesser men, had learned to use it as a tool when he needed to. No, this was something else entirely. It was the stillness of someone taking inventory, weighing options, calculating odds. The Omega was evaluating him, and Sterling found that strangely compelling. Most people either cowered in his presence or tried too hard to impress him. This one was doing neither. Mr. Vance, Elias said. His voice was low, steady, without the tremor most people exhibited when confronted by an alpha of Sterling's prominence. He'd clearly recognized him from the company's annual report or the portrait in the lobby. No stumbling over the name. No nervous babbling. Just that same calm composure he'd shown on the footage. "You were in the penthouse boardroom last night," Sterling said, his voice carrying the casual weight of an interrogation. "I was cleaning the penthouse boardroom last night," Elias replied, his gray-green eyes meeting Sterling's gaze directly. No flinching, no avoidance. "As scheduled. It's on the roster. I do it every Thursday. You touched my drawings." Elias held his gaze for a beat longer than was strictly comfortable. "I left a note," he said simply. "I noticed." Sterling crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe with studied casualness. "You want to explain that?" The seismic dampening calculations on floors 23 through 28 were incorrect, Elias said, his voice flat and matter-of-fact, like he was explaining something that should have been obvious. The system as designed would have a natural frequency that aligns too closely with the expected ground motion during a moderate earthquake. Resonance amplification would occur, not in the first quake, probably, but the second or third. Given the site's location on the Fraser River Delta and the specific soil profile, you'd be looking at cumulative fatigue failure within 15 to 20 years. The building wouldn't collapse, not immediately, but it would develop stress fractures that would compromise its structural integrity over time. He paused, setting down the box of supplies he'd been holding. The correction redistributes the load through 3 additional cross braces and brings the safety factor from 1.6 to 2.3, well above the National Building Code requirement of 1.5. If you want to verify the math, it's all there in the note. I left my calculations on the back. Sterling stared at him for a long moment. The kid? No, not a kid. A man, an Omega who was clearly well into adulthood, had just summarized a complex structural engineering problem with the casual confidence of someone discussing the weather. And he'd done it without hesitation, without qualification, without any of the self-doubt that Sterling would have expected from someone without formal credentials. You just wrote it down, Sterling repeated flatly. He could feel his alpha instinct stirring, that combination of admiration and wariness that came when he encountered someone who was smarter than they had any right to be. I know I shouldn't have touched anything. I'm sorry about that. Elias straightened, and Sterling caught the subtle shift in his posture. Not defiance, but the quiet confidence of someone who knew he was right and didn't need to prove it to anyone. But the math was wrong, and it was sitting right there. I couldn't just walk away from it. Couldn't walk away? No. Elias met his eyes again, and there was something in his gaze that made Sterling's breath catch. I look at numbers, and I see patterns. I see where they're wrong, and I can't unsee it. It's like, he paused, searching for the right words. It's like seeing a crack in a windshield. You know it's there, you know it's going to spread, and even if no one else notices it, you can't pretend you don't see it. Sterling was quiet for a moment, processing that. You're not wrong, he finally said. I checked. 30 minutes of checking, and every single one of your corrections checked out perfectly. Better than perfectly. You caught something my entire engineering team missed. I know, Elias said, with no trace of arrogance. That's why I left the note. Sterling brought him up to the penthouse boardroom. The Omega sat across the enormous mahogany table from him, still in his gray uniform, hands folded on the polished surface, posture composed, and utterly without pretense. He answered Sterling's questions the way someone answers when they're not performing confidence, but simply possess it, the way water possesses wetness. There was no desperation in him, no hunger for approval. He just was what he was, and he seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Where did you learn structural engineering? Sterling asked, leaning back in his chair, studying the Omega across the table with predatory attention. He'd been in enough interrogations to know how to read people, how to spot the tells that gave away truth or deception. But Elias Cross was giving him nothing to work with. Civil engineering textbooks, Elias told him. Vancouver Public Library on Georgia. The technical section on the second floor, sections 3 through 6. I worked through them over about 4 years, alongside free online courses from MIT OpenCourseWare and various university lecture series on YouTube. The ones by Professor Ashford and Dr. Khalil are particularly good. There's also a professor at UBC who posts his lectures online, and I've been following those for about 2 years now. MIT OpenCourseWare, Sterling said flatly. He'd heard of it, of course. Everyone had. But he'd never actually met someone who'd used it to become functionally expert in a professional field. All free. All online. Elias almost smiled. Almost, but not quite. The corners of his mouth twitched, and something in Sterling's chest tightened at the sight. You'd be surprised what you can access at 2 in the morning when the building's quiet, and you've got the office Wi-Fi password. I've probably taken more courses than most of your engineers did in their actual degrees. The difference is I didn't have to pay for them. You used the office Wi-Fi. I was in the office. Elias shrugged, a small motion that made his shoulders shift under the gray uniform. You never said I couldn't. And honestly, it's not like I was streaming movies. I was studying. Sterling rubbed his jaw with one hand, trying to process the casual audacity of that statement. Did you go to university? Actually enroll, I mean. The Omega's composure shifted, just barely. It was subtle enough that Sterling almost missed it, a slight tightening around his eyes, a fractional change in his scent. I started civil engineering at UBC, he said. 2 years in. I was doing well, actually. Top of my class. What happened? Elias looked down at the table for a moment before answering. His scent shifted again, something like ozone before a storm, controlled but present. Sterling could read the effort it took for him to stay composed. "My parents died," he said, and the words came out flat, rehearsed, like he'd said them so many times they'd lost all meaning. In Calgary, there was a structural failure in a parking garage they were walking through. A column gave way, and the whole thing came down. The investigation found the original engineers had miscalculated the bearing capacity of the support columns, a failure that could have been caught if someone had looked more carefully. He paused, and Sterling watched his throat work as he swallowed. "I was in second year at UBC. I went home, and I didn't come back." Sterling set his pen down, giving the Omega his full attention. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his alpha instincts making him want to reach out, to offer some kind of comfort. But he held back, because Elias Cross didn't seem like the kind of man who accepted comfort easily. "I had a younger brother, Julian," Elias continued. "He was 15 at the time. 15 years old, and suddenly he was an orphan with no one but his older brother. And I had to choose. I could go back to school, finish my degree, leave him in the system, or I could step up and be what he needed. It wasn't a choice, really. It was survival." "So you became what he needed," Sterling said softly. "Yes." Elias looked up, and his gray-green eyes were steady, clear. "And in the spaces between everything else, early mornings, late nights, between shifts, I kept reading. Because I needed to understand how things break, how people get hurt when they weren't supposed to, how to make sure it never happened again." His jaw tightened. "I needed to know that when I looked at a structure, I could see what might go wrong. Because I couldn't bear the thought of someone else losing someone the way I lost my parents. Not if I could have done something to prevent it." The room was very quiet. Sterling was aware of the hum of the building's HVAC system, the distant sound of traffic starting to build on the streets below. He was aware of the Omega sitting across from him. This man who had the self-taught brilliance of a structural engineer and the quiet strength of someone who'd had to carry more than his share. He was aware of his own heartbeat, steady and slow, but there was something else too, something that felt like recognition. Like seeing something in another person that you hadn't even realized you were looking for. "Elias," Sterling said, and he heard his own voice soften in a way it rarely did. The Omega's name felt different on his tongue than he'd expected. "You saved us a significant amount of money, and possibly a very bad outcome down the road. That's not nothing." "I left a sticky note," Elias said, his tone carefully neutral. "I didn't do anything remarkable." Sterling leaned forward, letting his alpha presence fill the space between them. "My structural team didn't catch that in 8 weeks of review." 8 weeks. With all their degrees, all their experience, all their fancy software. And you caught it in 5 minutes. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then his expression shifted, just slightly, and Sterling caught that almost smile again. "Then maybe they need better coffee," he said. "Late-night clarity is underrated. There's something about being alone in the dark with a problem that makes you see it differently. Or maybe you're just better than they are," Sterling said bluntly. Elias blinked, clearly surprised by the directness. "I don't. You don't have to be modest with me," Sterling interrupted. "I'm not in the business of pretending people are something they're not. You're smart. You're very smart. And you've done more with your circumstances than most people do with every advantage in the world. So take the compliment." Elias stared at him for a moment. Then, slowly, the almost smile became something more real. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Vance." "Neither are you, Elias Cross." Sterling told himself it was scientific curiosity. That was the reason, 3 days later, he left a set of drainage plans on the boardroom table. Plans with a deliberate error buried in the roof slope calculations, a subtle thing, the kind of thing a person might miss if they were moving quickly. It was a test, pure and simple. He needed to know if the first time had been a fluke. He found the note the next morning taped to the top sheet, the handwriting now familiar. He'd been checking the boardroom every hour since he'd left the plans, and the moment he saw the yellow sticky note, something in his chest loosened that he hadn't even realized was tight. "Your rooftop drainage slope is 0.4%. Vancouver gets 1.6 meters of rain annually, and you're proposing this?" I've increased it to 1.8% and redistributed toward the west drain. You're welcome. EC. P.S. We live in a temperate rainforest. Plan accordingly. Sterling laughed before he could stop himself. A real laugh, sudden and warm in the empty room. He hadn't laughed like that in longer than he could remember. He read the note 3 times, and each time he found himself smiling at the dry humor tucked into the precision. He left another problem the following Monday. A fire egress calculation this time. One that technically passed minimum code, but cut it close enough to make any experienced eye uncomfortable. The note came back by Tuesday. The secondary stairwell exit width is exactly at the minimum threshold. Minimum and acceptable are not synonymous. I've widened it by 250 millimeters. If there's ever an emergency in this building, the people inside it will thank you. EC. P.S. Whoever approved this originally had a very flexible definition of fine. Probably the same person who thought 0.4% slope was acceptable in a rainforest. By Wednesday, Sterling had stopped pretending it was a test. He was waiting for the notes, anticipating them with the kind of eagerness he hadn't felt since he was a young alpha building his first company. He'd started reading the notes multiple times, finding himself smiling at the dry humor tucked into the precision. He'd started leaving the plans out later, staying in the office when he could have gone home, just to see if Elias would show up. On a Thursday night near the end of March, Elias found him instead. Sterling was still at the table at 12:30, jacket off, sleeves rolled up to reveal the muscle and ink of his forearms, surrounded by permit documents and a long cold cup of coffee. He looked like a man who had forgotten that time was a thing that passed, who had been so deep in the numbers that the world outside had ceased to exist. His tie was undone, hanging loose around his neck, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and not enough sleep. "You're still here," Elias said from the doorway, his cleaning cart behind him. His voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Observant," Sterling said without looking up. He was aware of the Omega's presence in a way he couldn't quite explain, the subtle scent of rain and concrete, the quiet weight of his regard. It made him want to look up, to meet those gray-green eyes, but he forced himself to stay focused on the documents in front of him. Elias started cleaning quietly around him, working the perimeter first, leaving the center of the room for last. He moved with that same efficient grace, never seeming to rush, never seeming to waste motion. Sterling watched him from his peripheral vision, the way he moved, the methodical efficiency of his work. There was something calming about it, about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing and did it without fuss. Something that made the chaos in Sterling's head settle. "The notes," Sterling said after a while. His voice was rough from lack of use, and he cleared his throat before continuing. "I owe you an apology." He said it to the table, not to Elias. It was easier that way, not having to look at the Omega's face while he admitted what he'd done. "For what?" Elias's voice was neutral, but Sterling could hear the curiosity underneath. "I left those problems on purpose." Sterling finally looked up, meeting the Omega's steady gaze across the room. "After the first time, I wanted to see if it was real. If you were real. So I planted errors and waited to see if you'd catch them." He paused, the weight of what he'd done settling on him. "It wasn't fair. You were just doing your job, and I was playing games with you." Elias set down his cloth on the cart and turned to face him fully. He didn't look angry. If anything, he looked faintly amused, something that made Sterling's alpha instincts sit up and pay attention. It wasn't the reaction he'd expected. "I know," Elias said simply. Sterling blinked. "You knew? The drainage plans had your handwriting in the margins. You corrected the header, but not the body. The slope error was too clean to be an accident." Elias tilted his head slightly, and Sterling caught the glint of intelligence in his eyes. "And nobody leaves fire egress calculations sitting on an open table by accident. Those are sensitive documents, and you're too careful to leave them out unless you want someone to see them. You didn't say anything. I didn't mind." Elias pulled out the chair across from Sterling and sat down, which he had never done before. He settled into the leather seat with an ease that suggested he was comfortable in places like this, even if his uniform said otherwise. I actually liked it. It was like someone was taking me seriously, even if it was secretly. Like someone thought I was worth testing, worth proving myself to. Something shifted in Sterling's chest. A warmth he didn't have a name for. Something that felt suspiciously like admiration. I didn't think of it that way. Most people wouldn't. Elias leaned back in his chair, studying Sterling with those gray-green eyes. Most people would see it as a violation, an invasion. But I'm not most people, and I've learned to see the positive in things that other people would see as problems. It's a survival skill. I've noticed, Sterling said dryly. You're very good at seeing the positive. It's easier than being angry all the time. Elias shrugged, a small motion that made his shoulders shift under the gray fabric. Anger takes work, and I've never had the energy to waste on it. That was the moment Sterling realized he was in trouble. Not the kind of trouble that came with bad business decisions or corporate espionage. The kind of trouble that came with catching feelings for someone who could match him wit for wit and challenge for challenge. The kind of trouble that made you want to build something with someone instead of just for yourself. And he was a man who had built everything in his life. He'd built a company from nothing, built a reputation that was the envy of his industry, built a life that was exactly what he'd always wanted. But he'd never built something with someone else. He'd never wanted to. Until now. Why do you know what you know? Sterling asked, and it wasn't a challenge this time. It was just a question, a genuine one. I mean, I understand the textbooks, the online courses. But there's a difference between knowing theory and being able to apply it the way you do. The way you see problems, the way you just know where things are wrong. That's not something you learn from a book. Elias was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, but carefully so, the controlled voice of someone discussing a wound that hadn't quite healed. My parents didn't just die, he said. I was the one who found out about the engineering failure. I was the one who read the investigation report, who saw the numbers, who understood exactly what had gone wrong. I was the one who realized that someone could have caught it, if they'd just paid attention, if they'd looked harder, if they'd cared enough to do their job properly. He looked at his hands, those steady, capable hands that had corrected a catastrophic error without hesitation. And I couldn't let that happen again. I couldn't be the person who walked away from a wrong number, who pretended it wasn't there, who let other people's lives depend on someone else's carelessness. So I made myself learn. I made myself see. I trained my brain to notice the things that other people miss, because I couldn't bear the thought of someone else losing someone the way I lost them. Sterling felt something crack open in his chest. Elias. Don't. Elias said gently, cutting him off before he could continue. Don't say you're sorry. People always say they're sorry, and it doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring anyone back, doesn't fix the broken things, doesn't make the world any safer. He almost smiled again, that same wry expression that made Sterling want to lean closer. I'm fine. I've been fine for a while. I just need you to understand why I can't look at a wrong number in a structural drawing and walk away from it. It's not a choice. It's just who I am. I understand, Sterling said, and he did, for the first time completely. He understood the weight of loss, the way it could shape a person, the way it could drive them to become something extraordinary. He understood the need to make things right, to fix what was broken, to prevent the same tragedy from happening again. He understood because he'd felt something similar himself, though he'd never lost anyone the way Elias had. He'd just always felt the need to build things that wouldn't fall down. I'm sorry about your parents, he said anyway, because he couldn't not say it. That's not an apology for the geometry. That's just acknowledgement. That they mattered, and what happened to them was wrong, and the fact that you've turned that into something good doesn't make it less tragic. Elias's eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them, something that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them felt. The Omega's scent shifted again, just barely, a hint of something warmer underneath the rain and concrete. Thank you, Elias said softly. That's the first time someone said that without making it about me. without making it about how strong I am or how amazing it is that I survived. Just acknowledging that it happened and it was wrong. That's what you deserved, Sterling said. Someone to acknowledge it. Elias looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up, gathering his cleaning supplies. I should finish my rounds, he said. It's almost 1 in the morning, and I still have 3 more floors. I'll be here, Sterling said, surprising himself with the words. If you want to come back up. If you want to talk more. Or just not be alone. Elias paused at the door, turning back to look at him. His gray-green eyes were unreadable. You don't have to do that, he said. You don't have to pretend to be interested in me just because I helped you with your project. I'm not pretending, Sterling said, and his voice came out firm, certain. I don't pretend, Elias. I'm not that kind of man. If I didn't want you here, I would tell you to leave. I would have never brought you up to the boardroom in the first place. The fact that I did, the fact that I keep finding reasons to talk to you, that's not professional curiosity. That's something else entirely. Elias's expression shifted again, something like hope flickering in his eyes before he suppressed it. I should go, he said, and his voice was slightly rougher than before. I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Vance. Sterling corrected. Call me Sterling. The Omega's breath caught. Then he nodded once and left, and Sterling was alone in the boardroom with a cold cup of coffee and the sense that something in his life had just permanently shifted. Sterling didn't sleep well that night. He kept replaying the conversation, the way Elias had looked at him, the way the Omega had sat across from him with all the quiet composure of someone who had learned to make himself small so the world wouldn't crush him. He kept thinking about the way Elias's scent had shifted, the way his eyes had flickered with something that might have been hope, might have been fear, might have been both at once. It made Sterling feel protective, and that was dangerous. He was an alpha, a successful alpha. He'd had plenty of interested Omega parties over the years, but none of them had ever made him feel like this. Like he'd found something rare and precious and was terrified of breaking it. Like he actually cared about whether someone was okay, beyond the casual concern he extended to his employees. Like he wanted to build something with someone, not just something for himself. The next day, he walked down to the maintenance office with a file folder under his arm. He found Elias stacking supplies in the storage room, and the Omega looked up with that same careful stillness when he saw Sterling in the doorway. I have a proposition for you, Sterling said, cutting straight to the point. He'd never been good at beating around the bush, and he wasn't about to start now. Elias raised an eyebrow. That's usually not a good thing when you say it like that. In my experience, propositions from alphas tend to come with strings attached. I'm offering you a position, Sterling said, ignoring the Omega's defensive tone. Structural consultant. 20 hours a week, flexible schedule, health benefits, for weeks leave, an office with a window that actually faces the sun. You'd work directly with the engineering team, reviewing plans and providing input. You'd get a real salary, not minimum wage. You'd get the respect you deserve. Elias stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're serious. I'm always serious about things that matter. You barely know me. I know you corrected a potentially catastrophic error without being asked, Sterling said, ticking off the points on his fingers. I know you're self-taught, and probably better at this than most of my team with their fancy degrees. I know you have a younger brother you're raising alone, and I know it can't be easy. And I know. He paused, considering his words carefully. I know you don't trust people easily. Neither do I. So maybe we can work on that together. Elias's gray-green eyes searched his face for something. A lie? A hidden agenda? Sterling didn't know. Whatever he found, it seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly after a long moment. Julian has exams in May, he said. I take that week off, non-negotiable. He needs me there for support, and I'm not going to let him down. Agreed. And I want my own parking spot, Elias continued, his voice gaining confidence. The building services staff park 4 blocks away, and I'm tired of walking in the rain. My shoes are always wet. Sterling nodded. Done. Elias set down the box he was holding and straightened, looking Sterling directly in the eye. There's one more condition, he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sterling's alpha instinct sharpen. You have to stop seeing me as the maintenance guy. You have to see me as what I actually am, someone who's good at this and can help you. And you have to stop letting people treat me like I don't belong. It's going to take some work, Sterling admitted. I know. Elias picked up his box and walked past him, close enough that Sterling caught a breath of his scent, clean and warm, and something underneath that made his alpha instincts want to lean in closer. Lucky for you, Elias said, glancing back over his shoulder. I'm patient. I've been waiting for someone to take me seriously for a long time. I can wait a little longer. The office Sterling had promised was ready 3 days later. It was small but bright, with a north-facing window that looked out over the harbor, a decent chair that didn't make your back hurt, and a desk that was big enough for the spread of blueprints Elias was quickly accumulating. He'd brought in a few personal touches, a photograph of his brother Julian on the desk, a small succulent plant that was clearly being kept alive through sheer determination, a battered copy of a structural engineering textbook that looked like it had been read dozens of times, with pages marked and annotated in the same precise handwriting that Sterling had come to recognize. Sterling made it a habit to stop by. He told himself it was professional interest, that he was just checking in on his new consultant, making sure he had everything he needed. But the truth was something else entirely. He found excuses to walk past the office, to bring coffee, to ask questions that could have been answered by email. He found himself looking forward to the late nights when Elias would be in the office, studying plans with that focused concentration that made him look untouchable and vulnerable at the same time. You don't have to keep checking on me, Elias said one afternoon, looking up from a set of plans with that half-amused expression that was becoming dangerously familiar. I'm not going to run away. I have a parking spot now, remember? I'm not checking on you, Sterling said, leaning against the doorframe. I'm just present. Elias snorted. That's possibly the least convincing thing you've ever said. It's also the most honest thing I've said all day. Elias set down his pen and studied him, that gray-green gaze that made Sterling feel like he was being X-rayed. What are you doing, Sterling? It was the first time he'd used Sterling's first name, and something about it made the alpha's chest tighten. It felt important, like a door that had been unlocked, like a line that had been crossed. Learning, Sterling said honestly. Trying to figure out what I'm dealing with. And what have you figured out? Sterling walked into the office and sat down across from him, the space feeling smaller and more intimate with the Omega so close. He could smell Elias's scent more clearly now, clean soap and rain, and something else underneath that was pure Omega, controlled but present. I've figured out that you're the most interesting person I've met in years, he said. I've figured out that you're probably smarter than everyone I've ever hired. And I've figured out that I keep making excuses to be near you. And I'm starting to think that's not just professional curiosity anymore. Elias's expression didn't change, but his scent shifted, just a hint of warmth, of something that might have been interest. That's quite a lot of figuring out. I'm thorough. I've noticed. There was a beat of charged silence between them. Sterling could hear his own heartbeat, steady and slow, but there was something else too. Something that felt like anticipation, like the moment before something important happened. Look, Elias said finally, leaning back in his chair. I'm not going to pretend I haven't noticed. You're an alpha who's used to getting what he wants. I'm an omega who's used to being seen as a problem to solve or a conquest to achieve. I don't know what you actually want from me, but I'm not interested in being a puzzle for you to figure out and then put away when you're bored. Sterling leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. I'm not trying to solve you. I'm trying to know you. There's a difference. Is there? There is. Sterling held his gaze, not letting himself look away. The way I see it, you've been solving everyone else's problems for years. Your brothers, your employers, now mine. Maybe it's time someone paid attention to you. Maybe it's time someone noticed that you're not just a resource to be used, but a person to be known. Elias was quiet for a long moment, and Sterling could see the war going on behind his eyes. the desire to trust warring with the caution that had kept him safe for so long. Finally, he spoke. "Okay," he said. "If you're serious about knowing me, then start with something simple. Tell me something about yourself that isn't in your company bio." Sterling thought about it. "I grew up in a small town outside of Kamloops. My father was a mechanic. He taught me how to fix things, how to take them apart, and put them back together better than before. And I think that's where the building thing started, wanting to make things that work, that don't break. That last. My father died when I was 20, and I inherited his tools. I still have them." Elias's expression softened slightly. "I didn't know that. It's not the kind of thing I usually tell people. So why tell me?" Sterling met his eyes. "Because you asked. And because I want you to know me too. I want you to see that I'm not just a CEO, not just an alpha. I'm someone who lost his father too. Someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing." Elias was quiet for a moment, his eyes searching Sterling's face. "You're not what I expected," he finally said. "Neither are you," Sterling said. "So maybe we can be unexpected together." As the weeks passed, their interactions became more frequent, more personal. Sterling found himself looking forward to the late nights when Elias would be in the boardroom, studying plans with that focused concentration that made him look untouchable and vulnerable at the same time. They worked together on project after project, and Sterling watched the way Elias's mind worked. The quick connections, the ability to see problems that others missed, the quiet confidence that came from knowing you were right. He was an Omega who didn't fit the usual mold, who had built himself into something extraordinary out of necessity and grief. And Sterling, for the first time in his life, was completely and utterly captivated. It was a Thursday night when things changed between them. They were in the boardroom, going over the final mechanical plans for the tower, and it was past 1 in the morning. Sterling was exhausted, his tie undone, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, but he couldn't stop working, couldn't stop watching Elias's hands as they moved across the blueprints. "You need to sleep," Elias said, not looking up from his work. His voice was soft, but there was an edge of concern underneath that Sterling hadn't heard before. "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've been running on coffee and determination for the last 3 days, and it's starting to show. You're making mistakes." Elias finally looked up, and his gray-green eyes were warm with something that might have been worry. "You're going to burn out, and then where will I be?" "Fully employed, and probably running the company," Sterling said dryly. "I've already put you in my will as a backup CEO." "You're welcome." Elias laughed, actually laughed, a low warm sound that made Sterling's chest ache. "I've only been here 2 months. I'm not ready for that kind of responsibility. You'd be brilliant at it." "Flatterer." "I'm serious." Sterling set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, studying the Omega across the table. "You're the most capable person I've ever met. You've done more in 2 months than my team did in 6. And you do it all with this," he gestured vaguely. "This quiet thing you have. This way of being that makes people trust you, that makes them want to follow you." Elias's expression went still. "You trust me?" "I trust you with my projects," Sterling said. "With my reputation, with things that matter to me. Yeah, I trust you. More than I've trusted anyone in a long time." The silence between them was the kind that didn't need to be filled. Sterling could hear Elias's breathing, soft and even, and he was acutely aware of the Omega's scent, warm now, with undertones that made his alpha instincts sit up and take notice. "Elias," Sterling said, and his voice came out lower than he'd intended. "Don't," Elias said, but it was softer than before. He didn't look away. "Don't what?" "Don't make this about the project. What if I want to make it about something else?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he put down his pen and looked at Sterling with an expression that was impossible to read. "What are you actually saying?" Sterling stood up and walked around the table to where Elias was sitting. He didn't crowd him, didn't push, just stood close enough that he could see the Omega's pulse at his throat, steady, not afraid. "I'm saying," Sterling said, his voice pitched low, "that I've been looking for excuses to be near you for months. I'm saying I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the night you left that first note. And I'm saying I don't know what this is, but I'd like to find out. With you, if you want. Elias looked up at him, and for the first time, the Omega's composure cracked. Just a little, just enough for Sterling to see something that looked like one underneath it. His scent shifted, warmer now, with an undertone of something that made Sterling's alpha instincts want to lean in closer. You're my boss, Elias said, but there was no conviction in it. I'm your employer, Sterling corrected. That can change. I can change it. I can make it so you report to someone else, so there's no conflict. I can make it so the only thing between us is what we choose to build. How? I don't know yet. Sterling crouched down so they were at eye level, his hands resting on his knees. But I know I want to try. I know I've never wanted anything like this before. I know that when I'm around you, I feel like I'm actually alive, not just going through the motions. And I know that I'm not going to let a job title stop me from finding out what this could be. Elias studied him for what felt like an eternity. His scent was warm and complicated, and Sterling could read the warring emotions in it. Interest, hesitation, hope, fear. You're going to cause problems, Elias finally said. You know that, right? People are going to talk. They're going to say I slept my way into this position. They're going to say you're taking advantage of me. They're going to say all kinds of things. Let them, Sterling said. I don't care what people think. I care what you think. I care about what's actually real between us. Elias reached out and put his hand on Sterling's arm, his fingers curling around the alpha's wrist. It was the first time he'd initiated contact, and Sterling felt it like a brand, like something that was going to change him forever. I need you to know something, Elias said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. I'm not going to be someone's secret. I've spent my whole life being hidden, being small, being told to stay in my place. If we do this, if there's actually something between us, I need it to be real. Out in the open. No hiding. No pretending. If you're ashamed of me, if you want to keep me tucked away where no one can see, then this isn't going to work. Sterling looked at him. This man who had survived loss and hardship, who had raised his little brother and taught himself structural engineering and refused to be broken by any of it. And in that moment, he knew he'd do whatever it took to make this work. Okay, Sterling said. Then let's do it right. Let's be real. Let's be out in the open. Let's let everyone see exactly what we are to each other. I'm not ashamed of you, Elias. I'm proud of you. I'm proud of everything you've done, everything you've overcome. And I'm proud to be with you. Elias's eyes went wide, and for a moment, Sterling saw the vulnerability underneath the composure. You mean that? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. I mean every word, Sterling said. I don't say things I don't mean. It's not how I operate. It started slowly after that. Coffee dates that turned into dinners. Late nights at the office that turned into something else entirely. They kept things professional during working hours, mostly, but there were glances across the boardroom table that held more than professional interest, and meetings that ran longer than necessary, because neither of them wanted to leave. Sterling couldn't remember the last time he'd felt like this, like he was 20 again, like the world was full of possibilities, like he had something to look forward to beyond the next project. Elias made him want to be better, made him want to create things that would last, that would matter. And he was starting to realize that what he felt for the Omega was more than just interest, more than just attraction. It was something deeper, something that scared him a little. Your brother, Sterling said one evening, sprawled on the couch in Elias's small apartment. They'd been seeing each other for about a month, and Sterling had finally been invited to the place Elias shared with his sibling. It was small and modest, but it was clean and warm and full of the things that mattered. How's he handling the new situation? Elias smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that Sterling was starting to collect like treasures. Julian thinks you're intimidating, but probably not evil. His words, not mine. High praise. Coming from him, it's practically a love letter. Elias leaned back against Sterling, and the alpha wrapped his arm around him, drawing him close. He's been asking a lot of questions. Are you going to be around? Do you make me happy? What's going to happen when you get bored? All the usual stuff. I'm not going to get bored, Sterling said firmly. I know. I told him that. Elias looked up at him, and his gray-green eyes were soft. I told him that this is real, that you're not going anywhere, that he doesn't have to worry. And what did he say? He said he'd believe it when he sees it. Elias shrugged, a small motion against Sterling's chest. He's been hurt before. We both have. It takes time to trust. I know. Sterling pressed a kiss to the top of Elias's head. I'm patient, and I'm not going anywhere. I have a parking spot, remember? Elias laughed, the low warm sound that Sterling loved. You're impossible, and yet you keep me around. Someone has to keep you humble. The public revelation came at a company event 6 months later. It was a groundbreaking ceremony for the Lakeshore Tower, the project that had started everything. Sterling had arranged for a plaque to be placed at the base of the first cornerstone, and he'd asked Elias to be there as his guest. Not his employee, his partner. Elias wore a dark suit that Sterling had bought him, tailored to fit his lean frame perfectly. He looked sharp and self-possessed, his dark hair neatly styled, his gray-green eyes bright in the sunlight. And Sterling couldn't stop looking at him. He was the most beautiful thing in the room, and he didn't even seem to know it. I can feel you staring, Elias murmured, not looking away from the podium where the speeches were being given. He was standing beside Sterling, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. Enjoy it. I'm not going to stop. People are going to talk. Let them. The ceremony was full of speeches and photographs and the careful choreography of public relations. Sterling did his part, shaking hands and making small talk, but he was acutely aware of Elias's presence beside him, the Omega's familiar scent, the weight of his regard. He couldn't wait for it to be over so he could just be with him, away from the cameras and the expectations and the social niceties. When the moment came for the plaque unveiling, Sterling stepped to the microphone. The crowd quieted, waiting for him to speak. This project started with an error, he said, and his voice carried across the gathered crowd. A significant structural miscalculation that would have cost lives if it had gone uncorrected. And it was corrected by someone who didn't have the credentials, who didn't have the title, who didn't have the approval of anyone in this room. But he had the knowledge and the courage to speak up anyway. He turned and found Elias in the crowd, steady and composed as always, his gray-green eyes fixed on Sterling with something that looked like pride. Elias Cross has been my structural consultant for the last 6 months, Sterling continued. But before that, he was working the night shift, cleaning this building. And he did what none of my expensive engineers could do. He found a problem and fixed it. Because he couldn't walk away from something that wasn't right. Because he cares too much to let people get hurt. The crowd was shifting, murmuring. Sterling ignored them. He's also, Sterling said, and he felt his heart beat faster. Someone I've had the privilege of getting to know. Someone who's made me want to be better, to do better. And I'm not going to pretend anymore that he's just an employee to me. He's so much more than that. He looked directly at Elias across the crowd, and the Omega's expression was impossible to read, but his scent was warm, complex, full of everything he wasn't saying. Elias, Sterling said, I know you like to think things through. I know you'll tell me when you're ready and not a moment before. But I wanted you to know, in front of everyone, that I'm not hiding anymore. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending that what I feel for you is anything other than what it is. I love you. There was a collective intake of breath from the crowd. Sterling could hear the whispers starting, the careful repositioning of social hierarchies. He didn't care. He walked down from the podium and crossed the space to where Elias was standing. He held out his hand, and the Omega took it without hesitation. All right, Sterling asked softly, his thumb stroking across Elias's knuckles. Elias looked up at him, and there was something vulnerable in his gray-green eyes for once. You just outed us to the entire industry. In front of all your investors. On television. It's going to be everywhere. I know. The truth that you're dating your employee. That's going to cause problems. Then we'll deal with them. Sterling squeezed his hand. Together. Elias's smile when it came was worth every risk. You're insane. I've been told. Sterling pulled him closer, ignoring the gasps and camera flashes. But I'm also completely serious about this. About you. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. The months that followed were not always easy. There was scrutiny, speculation, the inevitable commentary from people who thought they understood the situation. Some of the older executives grumbled about nepotism. Sterling made sure they understood, in no uncertain terms, what he thought about that. And through it all, Elias was steady and calm and brilliant. He kept doing his work, kept making the buildings safer and smarter, kept being exactly the person Sterling had fallen for. He didn't let the criticism get to him, didn't let the whispers affect him. He just kept going, kept building, kept being the man who'd caught Sterling's attention with a yellow sticky note and a correction that had saved lives. "I don't know how you stay so composed," Sterling said one night, after a particularly trying board meeting. They were in Sterling's penthouse, the city lights spread out below them, and Sterling was still wired from the confrontation. "Practice," Elias said, leaning against the window. He was still in his suit, his tie loosened, his dark hair slightly mussed from running his hands through it. "When you've spent years being underestimated, you learn to let things slide off. You learn that what people think of you doesn't matter as much as what you know about yourself. I don't want you to have to let anything slide off. I want to protect you." Elias turned to look at him, and his expression was complicated. "I don't need protection, Sterling. I need partnership. That's what we have. That's what you gave me. Don't take it away by trying to shield me from something I've been dealing with my whole life." "I know." Sterling moved to stand beside him, close but not crowding. "I just hate that people make it harder for you. I hate that they can't see what I see. I hate that they judge you based on your job title instead of who you actually are. People have always made things harder." Elias shrugged, a small motion. "It's not new. And it's not going to stop me. Not from doing the work. Not from being with you. I've been through worse, Sterling. I lost my parents. I gave up my education. I raised my brother alone. A few people whispering behind my back is nothing compared to that." Something in Sterling's chest cracked open. "I love you," he said, and the words came out before he could think about them. Elias's breath caught. Then he turned and looked at Sterling with an expression that made the alpha's knees weak. "I know," Elias said softly. "I've known for a while. You're not very good at hiding it. And I love you too." Elias reached up and touched Sterling's face, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "I've known that for a while too. I just needed to be sure it was real. That you were real. That this wasn't just some passing thing for you." Sterling covered Elias's hand with his own, holding it there. "I'm real. This is real. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving it to you." "Big promises," Elias said, but he was smiling. "Big man," Sterling replied, and when Elias laughed, it was the best sound in the world. The Lakeshore Tower was completed a year later. Sterling and Elias stood on the observation deck on the 40th floor, looking out over the harbor, the building that they'd built together rising tall and proud above the city. The glass gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the water sparkled below them, and everything felt like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. "This is yours," Sterling said, gesturing at the view. "You made this possible. Without you, this building would be a death trap. Without you, people would have died." "I made a correction," Elias said. "You made the building. You made it happen. You believed in me, and you made it happen. That's what matters." "We made it," Sterling said firmly. "Together." Elias leaned into him, and Sterling wrapped his arm around the Omega's shoulder, drawing him close. The wind was cool up here, but Sterling was warm where Elias was pressed against him. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we keep going." Sterling pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "We keep building things that matter. We keep being real. He paused. "We keep being together. For as long as you want." Elias looked up at him, gray-green eyes warm and steady. "That's going to be a long time." "Good. When I said long, I meant a really long time. I'm not going anywhere." Elias smiled. One of those rare unguarded smiles that made Sterling's heart stop. "You'd better not. You're the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me." And you're the best thing that's ever happened to me, Sterling said, and he meant it. You walked into my life with a sticky note and a correction, and you changed everything. You made me want to be better. You made me want to build something that would last. You made me want to be someone who deserves you. Elias's eyes went soft, and he reached up to touch Sterling's face. You already deserve me, he said. You earned it. Every single day. The way you trusted me, believed in me, gave me a chance when everyone else would have looked the other way. You're not just a good alpha, Sterling. You're a good man. Sterling leaned down and kissed him, and the wind whipped around them, and the city spread out below them, and everything felt exactly right. 1 year later, a plaque went up in the lobby of the Beaumont Development offices. Sterling had ordered it without telling Elias, and the Omega saw it for the first time on a Wednesday morning when he came in for a meeting with the structural engineering team. The most important calculation is the one someone else is afraid to make. Elias stood in the lobby reading it for a long moment, his gray-green eyes soft. Then he went upstairs, knocked on Sterling's office door, and told him he was sentimental and impractical and that he was going to be late to his meeting. Worth it, Sterling said, pulling him close for a kiss. Absolutely worth it, Elias agreed, and he was still smiling when he walked into the meeting room, opened his notebook, and got to work.